Good day, everyone, and welcome. My name is Rudy Page, and I'm pleased in our current series of a chapter from my life and book. We are speaking to Carl Ryan, who's a mental health professional who I've known for many moons. Good day, Carl.
Good day to you, Rudy, and good day to the listeners and viewers as well.
Thank you. And you were right, because we will also be rebroadcasting this program on Fresh FM Radio London. It's a digital station which you can pick up, www.freshfmradiolondon.com. There's actually an app as well, so you can download the app onto your phone from the website. So, Carl, before we get into our dialogue about your book, just tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I am Carl Ryan, as you said, and you're quite right. I am Trinidadian, born and bred in Trinidad, and started my psychiatric career at St. Anne's Hospital, which is our only psychiatric facility in Trinidad. And it was my first and only job. So my first job was in psychiatry, and I suppose that's what I'm doing today, up to today.
Right.
You know, I didn't have much of an opportunity to further my studies in Trinidad. The opportunities were very limited. So I pursued extracurricular activities, as you would call it.
Mm-hmm.
And my preference was in sports, cricket, football, but mostly excelled in martial arts.
Okay.
So by the time I arrived in England, I was a martial arts instructor, physical training instructor, because, you know, I love the outdoor life. And that is how I got my adrenaline flowing.
Okay. Okay. Right. So in terms of your book, and you can remind us of the title, but what led you to conduct this type of research in the first place?
Well, the title of the book is Manual Restraints in Psychiatric Settings, Empirical Realities.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to change gear and to travel to sort of update my professional pursuits. So I traveled to England, didn't intend to stay that long, but no sooner I got there, I arrived in England in February 1990. And no sooner I got there that the hospital administrators asked me if I would assist them in developing a management of violence program for the staff. Mm-hmm. I said yes. So they sent me off to Broadmoor Hospital, which is one of three major psychiatric forensic hospitals in England. And I went through a 6-week intensive instructor program. And once I started learning and observing, I realized that these techniques have a martial arts base. And so I questioned some of the methods used at that time, because, you know, it referred to, you know, slamming people to the floor and this sort of thing. And so I thought, well, that could be a bit inappropriate, because we're dealing in a hospital setting where the duty of care is paramount. So I would question and discuss with others and challenge. And I recall teaching at a hospital in North London and discussing restraint situation with a senior research personnel. And he said, you know, this is a good subject for research. And I guess that was where the seed was planted. So I immediately started to seek out a supervisor. And I was turned down by 3 supervisors who thought, well, look, this is something new. I don't know anything about this. And they felt they weren't able to supervise. However, one professor at City University accepted me, and he did not have much knowledge in restraints, but he was interested in violence in psychiatry. In fact, he started a movement, Violence in Psychiatry, in which quite a few European countries had signed up to it. So I would accompany him and travel to various European countries and exchange research materials and so on. Luckily, I received a grant to do the program, and I found that to be great helpful. So I started the program at City University. As it was then, it was a new area which was never been researched before. So I had to design all my data gathering materials.
So are you saying then that in terms of restraint practice, there wasn't a kind of a origin or kind of history here in the UK relating to restraint practice?
Well, yes, there was a history, and but before I go to that, I want to quickly mention, which is part of my life as well. Got the grant, and part of the grant offering was a computer. And the computer was useful for me to record my data and so on. Coming up to the end of my study, a senior research administrator at the City University asked me to turn in the computer. I refused because my study was incomplete and I needed the computer to continue my studies. And the goodly gentleman wrote to me, mind you, this project started as a PhD study. This gentleman wrote to me telling me if I don't return the computer, he would see that I don't receive a PhD. And so said, so done. At the end of it, cutting a long story short, I didn't receive that PhD despite the immense nature of the work. And I was awarded a Master of Philosophy in Mental Health. I wasn't angry, I wasn't bitter, but I was very disappointed. But what, you know, on reflection, what kept me at peace was the journey, the research journey, and the experiences and knowledge I gained during that period was worth its weight in gold. And I realize now, you know, a certificate or, you know, something on paper is not has its value as much as that journey, that genuine journey you went through.
Of course.
Yeah. So I completed the thesis, sent the work in to the university, and 1 year after, VDM Publishers, an academic publishing company, contacted me, said, well, look, this is a unique piece of work. It's never been done before. We want to make it accessible to the wider world. And they asked permission to produce the thesis into a book.
Okay.
And that is how the book came about.
Okay.
And yes, and so eventually I had the course accredited by Greenwich University, which was the only restraint course to be accredited by a university in England.
Mm.
So historically, restraint has its tentacles in all parts of the world.
Mm.
And it's important to know that various sectors perform restraints in different ways. The army, for instance, have their way of restraining prisoners and placing them in prison camps. Hunters, they would catch live animals and bind their limbs together, run a rod or a stake in the space between the legs and hold them on the shoulders and take them home. That was called hog tie. And I mentioned this because hog tying is was introduced into restraints as well.
Yeah.
You know, straight jackets is another type of restraint. You know, as children growing up and you were seen to be misbehaving, and your mother or your grandmother mostly would give you a kind of eye we used to refer to as the evil eye. And you know, don't do that again or else. And that was a powerful restraint, you know. There is psychological restraints where you're threatened. For instance, in the war environment, if you don't behave, you will end up being restrained. So that gives restraint a sort of punitive sort of notion, you know. And of course, there are chemical restraints, mechanical restraints. And I want to mention that there's a significant difference between physical restraints and manual restraints, because persons tend to use the terms interchangeably. I'm not sure if they know what they mean. Physical restraints is a type of restraints where you tend to limit the person's ability to move. For instance, elderly patients who are restless and wandering, they would be placed in a sort of deep-seated chair. So that when they sit, it's difficult to get out of the chair. Or in some cases, they've used bean bags. Makes it difficult for them to get up and move around. Or there will be bed rails. Those are physical restraints. Manual restraint is where it involves the persons or a team of persons holding on to the individuals and manipulating their limbs in a safe way in order to carry out a certain exercise. So I thought I would make that distinction. Then you have mechanical restraints used by police officers and so on in terms of handcuffs. But historically, North America preferred mechanical restraints. That's like straps, 4-point restraints using leather straps. And because they thought that they need to demonstrate safety and accountability, because if anything happened to the patient while they are under their care, they'll have to answer charges of negligence and so on. But patients died as well, because there are cases when they were left unobserved and they would try to wiggle out of the restraints and they end up hanging themselves. Some patients were smoking and they fell asleep with the cigarettes, caught the linen, and they would go into death. So those are historical factors. In Europe and England, they more focus on manual restraints because they see that as a more humane way of dealing with patients in the hospital. Historically, in the UK, restraint practice started around the early 1980s. It so happened, and it started in the prisons. It so happened that prisoners would simulate fight scenes. And when the prison officers rushed in to investigate, the prisoners would turn on them and beat them up. So one officer who was seriously injured and was placed on light duty was also given the task of coming up with a new method of addressing these violent situations in the prison. And so Restraint was born. But when I look at, because in my literature review, I looked at literature from all over the world, and I saw where Canada in the 1970s had a similar program going. And I want to believe, while there is no direct written or historical link of exchange, I want to believe that somewhere along the line, the Canadian method was copied into the prison development of their own restraint practice. Again, historically, there's very little recorded for us to look back and see where or what is real or fantasy or myth. But that is the general picture.
So okay. So what to you were some of the key findings from your study? And then also you've touched on what you've been able to reflect on.
That is a very interesting question, because initially the thought was, or the thinking was, or that is what was being bandied around, that violent patients are restrained. But when I looked at the literature worldwide, I found the same thing, so much so that they associate restraints with violence. But when I came to my study, because my study was observation and questioning, I spent days and hours and nights on particular wards, and I would observe how the nurses went through their tasks, dealing with non-compliant patients on the ward. And generally what I found was that restraint was mostly removed from violence. I found that patients were mostly restrained when they refused to come into hospital. And that is understandable. Patients were restrained when they refused to take their medicine. And I don't see that as violence. Patients were restrained when they attempt to leave the ward against medical advice. Patients were restrained sometimes, very few times, but I found this to be important, when they disobeyed ward rules. And ward rules were kind of a discrete, non-written law where only the nurses know. For instance, the patient will be doing something and the nurse will say, don't do that. But the patient wouldn't know that before. So I found that very interesting. So I labeled that ward rules, So and things like patient nurses instructing patients to go to your room. That was a common thing. But what was interesting about that is that you have young nurses in their mid-20s, telling a middle-aged or a patient in their 60s, go to your room, when you could be my daughter or granddaughter, and they would get a bit of pushback. I must say, one of the important things I learned is that no one is mentally disordered 24 hours a day. In fact, sanity and insanity is like a train line. They run close together. So don't look at a mentally ill person and say, well, look, you could tell him anything and he wouldn't. They have feelings and they're more sensitive than the ordinary person. So
what would you say has been some of the consequences of this then, of restraint practice, given the kind of arbitrary nature at times?
Restraint was developed in the prisons to deal with violent prisoners. And so the emphasis was on the physical, the practicalities of it, physically holding them and then proceeding to do whatever they want to do. Now that was transferred into, that practice was transferred into forensic units like Broadmoor and they, that had this close link with the prisons. And so the practice was transferred unaltered.
Right, so kind of like we hear about mission creep, don't we?
Yeah. And so someone had this bright idea, but look, this is a lucrative business. We could teach or train would-be instructors for lots of money. And so that was quite lucrative. So the point I want to make is that the track of training from the prison to general psychiatry, the training was almost unaltered. And so this duty of care, while it looks good on paper, in practice, it was difficult to maintain because of the very nature of how the hospital staff manage their restraint practice. What is important is that restraint has its base in martial arts.
Okay.
There are three distinct types of martial arts that involve in restraint. That is Aikido, Judo, and Jiu-Jitsu. And so if someone is not martial arts inclined, and I'm starting with the instructors, how could you teach a skill that has its basis in martial arts? So interpretation is affected, and the most you could do is instruct the trainee to turn the arm this way, or do it this way, or put on a wrist lock that way, and so on. And so the training was not specific and detailed, and a lot of the meaning was lost during restraint practice. What I did as part of my study was observe a training, and then a course put on by the hospital instructors, and then sort of observe whether what they learned in the classroom was exactly practiced in the workplace. And what I found was a lot of deviations, because the techniques are sometimes complicated, and there are difficulties in remembering the techniques when you really need it. And so there were deviations. Staff resort to what they know best, like locking the patient's neck, because a desperate situation and so on. And what we have was a sort of a crossover, different staff being recruited by different hospitals, and staff learned a different model of training somewhere else, and that is brought in. And so on a restraint course, you will find 2 or 3 staff with different techniques in the same episode. So all that I found to be deviation from the practice. And this is why I think we need a national standard, wherever you train, you would come under the same sort of criteria and skills.
Yeah. So that consistency.
The consistency.
Yeah. Yeah. So given some of the objectives that you have outlined for restraint, what particular benefits have there been in terms of overall outcomes for staff and patients?
Well, the first benefit, I think, is the introduction of restraint practice into the psychiatric services. But of course, it has a bitter and sweet taste to it. And I still believe, despite several deaths and injuries and so on, that restraint techniques are useful tools for the staff. Could you imagine a police officer or police officers bringing a disruptive prisoner, mentally ill, to the ward with handcuffs, takes off the handcuffs and leave that person on the ward for the nurses to deal with their bare hands? They have no baton, no guns, no handcuffs, and yet they need to deal with this person. And if they refuse medication, which is meant to calm them down, then you would need to restrain them. So you could see the importance of dealing with non-compliant patients on the psychiatric wards. So the intention was good, but it needs to be standardized. The benefit, again, is for the nurse to carry out their tasks and their duties under quite difficult situations. Because when a patient refuses medication and he's a threat of, either of the risk is of harm to himself or others is being escalated, you have to be seen to be doing something. And sometimes restraint is the only way that you could really subdue the person in a humane and non-lethal way, I must say, in order to carry out the objective.
Okay. So, Carl, looking ahead to the future, what do you think will be some of the principles and philosophies regarding restraint practice?
Well, this thing about violence, it keeps playing on my mind. And I think that the brain is conditioned to respond to violence with offensive behaviors.
Self-protection.
Offensive, yes. Desperate protection, fear. Yeah. So if you are fearful of the patient, it's easy to label that patient as violent so that you could deal with them in a certain way. So I think the first thing is for us to define what violence is in the workplace. Because violence has a legal entity to it. For someone to be proven to be violent, you need to show intent. You have to prove intent. And with the mentally ill person, it's difficult to do that. But nevertheless, that person is a human being. And you need to look at other ways of thinking. And that is why I term my training interpersonal conflict management. Because, it's a conflict between the nurses and the patient. The patient, he is in a world of his own, and the nurses in a world of their own. And then you have this paternalistic model that still exists, where the nurses feel they know what is best. We know what is best for you, And so there's a conflicting situation going on. And when you think about conflict, then you look at solutions, mediations, de-escalation, moderation,
and also of course, yes, where the power lies as well.
Yes.
So there's a colleague of ours here in the UK. I don't know if you know her, Alicia Riley, and she runs a mental health project up in Wolverhampton called ACDI, African Caribbean Mental Health Organization. And one of the things that I learned from her, working with her in the past, is that she says that the best outcomes for people with mental ill health are to treat them with love, compassion, and with humanity.
I totally believe that. And I am a living example of that. And I say the same thing differently. I say, if you treat patients humanely, they're more likely to respond in a humane manner.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And so, you know, patients are human beings. And so we cannot despise them because we too are human beings. But, you know, we have this notion about us that, you know, he's a mentally ill person. He's a madman, what he knew. But I was pleasantly surprised because I had to interview patients after the restraint situation. And I could tell you, we don't give patients enough credibility for their intelligence. We think they're just mad, but they are very, very practical and straightforward. You know, one patient told me when I asked him what the nurse should have done rather than restrain you. He said, nurses shouldn't restrain me. It's only God should restrain me. He knows how to restrain. You know,
Yeah.
I found that to be quite a credible response. You know, one patient said, who was forced into hospital, he said, they shouldn't restrain me. They should place a computer by the hospital door, by the door, the door of the ward. And I would go and stand in front of that computer. And if the computer say, yes, you should be admitted, then I will walk into the hospital. You know, so I find those are quite useful technologies that we could use sometime in the future. You know?
That's excellent, because that reminds me of something Alicia told me once. And they were talking to a patient, and they were trying to convince him that the medication was good for him. And he turned around and said, well, if it's that good, why don't you take it first?
Yes. But I must mention that we tend to see the restraint, the power of restraint over the supposedly violent patient is lopsided. It's always the patient, the perpetrator, when in fact, most time unknowingly, the nurses, by the nature of how they communicate, could perpetrate the incident. But what is important as well is that the ward, especially the intensive care units and the acute units, are toxic environments. And nurses are required to work long shifts, 12-hour shifts. You know, most of them bring their lunch to work, so there's no escape. There's hardly a proper common room where the nurses to go and relax, you know. And even while having their meals and the alarm goes, they have to rush in to deal with situation because their colleagues are at risk, you know. So it's a toxic situation where patients of different, display different types of symptoms. And so, interestingly, once patients start to recover, they don't see themselves as mentally ill and they look down on the other patients.
Okay.
I recall one patient calling his mother and said, Mom, come and get me out of here. This patient's gonna get me mad in here. You know? And I find that was very, very interesting. Yeah.
So interesting, another interesting point I'd be interested in your perspective. If you look at where we are now, you know, having gone through COVID and the post-pandemic sort of world, and there's a lot of mental ill health to do with isolation, you know, fear, bereavement. And so, and we think a lot now, much more in terms of self-care practice within our communities, ourselves, i.e. to prevent people going into the system. I'm just thinking, in terms of your experience now, what advice would you give our community for family and friends who are displayed, you know, they don't seem to be as they were in the past? I mean, what can we do more in terms of, again, treating people within our own community with love, compassion, and humanity, because we've got to find a better way to keep people out of the health system wherever we live.
That's a tough one. Do you have another question? You know, it's like closing the gates after the horse have bolted. We're already in quite a desperate state. When we look at the actions and the behavior of human beings, we're becoming more erratic and in need of quick fixes. There's a lack of that mental discipline that is needed as a basis for us to offer something and for them to accept it. Because, you know, there's always this issue about, you don't know what you're talking about, man, I go, you know. And so the challenge will be to have a national model. You cannot do this in piecemeal because, okay, you are looking after a group of children and you're teaching them good practice, good values. But when they go home into the neighborhood, then they're influenced by what is going on in that neighborhood. So we either look at a national model or treat persons in family groups where everyone will be exposed at the same time, learning proper human values. And it does not go alone. It has to be a holistic approach. Because if you're the breadwinner and you're unemployed, you know, empty barrel cannot stand. So there need to be some support network so that this person will be willing to listen. And again, you know, the fear factor and the trust factor is a huge issue, that trust. Do we trust you enough to listen to you? Do we trust the politicians? You know, do we trust the doctors? You want to poison me? You know. So,
I mean, we've been through that that challenge around trust, and that's why we talk about trusted messengers. You know. Those medical scientists from within the community who people are willing to listen to because they know they have their best interests at heart.
At heart, yes.
And then of course, how can we better share the learning of how we have got over some of these challenges?
Impartially.
Absolutely.
Yes.
That's great, Carl. What I'm going to do, I'm going to open up to any of the other participants. Some I know you know very well, whether they would like to add anything or ask a question or have a particular perspective on anything that you said. So this is the opportunity for anyone else. So
great.
I have four questions or concerns. I wonder if I can share them.
Okay, is that Krishna speaking?
Krishna, yeah.
Right, Krishna, and then I'll come to you, Imo, afterwards. So Krishna.
Okay. Should I share all four of them?
Yeah, if you would just quickly.
Okay, quickly. My first concern was how widespread is physical restraint in mental hospitals today, considering from the 1950s onwards, psychiatric drugs have been used to address the kinds of acting out behaviors that need to be managed. I'm looking at from the time Philippe Pinel took away the shackles from patients and was trying to support a more humane way of addressing custody of patients. The second one is, are there particular kinds of mental disorders that seem to warrant physical restraint more than others? The third one was physical restraint. I have a question mark. Then what? Looking at the potential for further acting out by the same clients or same types of clients, what's the status of behavioral therapeutic interventions or even cognitive type behavioral interventions. And the last one is, should hospitals and mental institutions be mandated to develop standardized guidelines for use of physical restraints, taking patient rights, human rights into consideration? This comes from what Mr. Ryan shared earlier. Okay, that's it.
Carl?
Yes, I'll take the last one first. You know, mental health legislation, I believe, is one of the most powerful legislation in the world. And I would like to hear what Adri would have to say about that. And so while there are lots and lots of suggestions and mandates, you know, criminal law, common law, health and safety, in the workplace, human rights, UN Convention on Human Rights, WHO, Department of Health, NICE, Royal College of Psychiatrists, and the list goes on and on. And, but it stopped short. You would hear messages from the Department of Health. Hospitals who are purchasing training should ensure that they that training is provided by a competent instructor. It stops there. But where are the guidelines to ensure that these instructors are competent? There are hardly any. And so when we look at Rocky Bennett, we know as a famous case. His case was only highlighted because his sister was a high-profile person and she was very vocal. And when you look at his situation, you would realize that something went wrong somewhere, and he was almost punished. It started in one ward where a white or Caucasian patient abused him, and he retaliated, and he was moved from that ward when you would think that the perpetrator should be moved. And he was sent to a neighborhood up north where there were hardly people that looked like him. And it feels as though that was a punishment move. And so he got into conflict with a white nurse, and I understand that he hit the nurse. And boy, who'd tell you to do that? You know, he was restrained and he ended up dying. So then I wonder, where does restraint stops and punishment begins?
Right. What about the other three questions? Don't forget the other three questions, because we...
Yes. And so physical restraint or manual restraint is, as I go back to what I said earlier, it needs to be standardized. And medication administration is a type of restraint we call chemical restraints. But there needs to be a balance, because before I forget, restraint should be seen as a medical model because of all the medical implications and complications. Patients who are restrained could suffer crush injuries unknowing to anyone. And if they're administered medication around that time, then they could possibly die, you know. So there have to be some medical understanding. And so because medication is a type of restraints, and you have manual restraints, and then you have seclusions. And I've seen where patients are restrained, given medication, and placed in seclusion. That is 3 intense restraint situations. And this is where there are lack of guidelines and protocols and justification that needs to be in place to ensure that these things don't happen, because that is when patients lose their lives, unfortunately, you know. So generally, that is
Okay.
Krishna, if I left out anything that you were expecting, just let me know.
Yeah.
No. Thank you very, very much. I
Thank-
appreciate it.
Thank you, Krishna.
Thank you.
Imo, you got your hand up. Then I'll come to
good.
Agri.
Yeah, good day, good day. Yeah, good
Okay.
day to all you call Brother Ryan. Yeah.
So,
I suspect that the research you reported on was, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, was in your early days of work in England. Is that so, Brother Ryan?
Yes, between 2002 and 2009.
All right. Well, I know you're now based here, but I guess you're very much in contact with what's happening in the UK.
Yeah.
Now, to what extent are those measures still being used? And if they are still being used, I guess it may not be the best approach, as you suggested. And it very much resembles what I've heard about from people working at St. Anne's here in Trinidad. So I think if we could get the current situation would be useful, because I mean, it's all different types of patients you all will have to, hospitals will have to deal with,
Yeah.
I know you mentioned about legislation. That is always important, policy, and I would say practicality, because, you might have a person who entering who is highly violent. I mean, you've got to have a real proper protocol in place. I don't think that being left up to the nurses and them alone is the wisest approach. So I don't know if you could shed some light as to the current situation and the width of measures to really deal with particularly violent patients. So that is it in a nutshell, Brother Ryan.
Yeah, thank you.
Right. The situation hasn't changed much. As I said earlier, there are lots of legal suggestions of what you should do, but how you do is lacking. Up to last week, I spoke to a staff who is working actively on the ward, and when I discussed my work with him, he said, well, we don't do that again. We focusing more on the escalation, and that's fine. But 95% of conflicts are managed by de-escalation anyway. So I asked, what about if you have, I think she said that well, we just have some big, strong patients coming in there, and say, well, how would you deal with that? And she said, we just call the police. Now, there lies the problem, because the police are not sufficiently trained to deal with mentally ill persons. They are there to deal with people who break the law. But unfortunately, most of the persons that the police confront in the streets have some sort of mental disorder, and so there is a lack of this duty of care that the police would need to have. And I still find it difficult to understand how police officers could switch immediately in seconds from dealing with crime situation to deal with a mentally ill person who needs a softer approach, and so they continue with what they know best, with the rough tactic. It's helpful, because without the police, how could we deal with persons in the community? But they need more scientific training and monitoring and accountability. Too many patients die at the hand of the police, and there are little or no accountability, So that is problematic for me. So in essence, the situation has not changed much. In fact, the training is being watered down to 2 days and 3 days, because administrators are saying that they can't allow their staff off the ward for that long. And so
leave.
that causes So that caused another problem. The problem is we don't have any expert in restraint practice in the UK. And to be an expert, you need to be evidence-based driven. You cannot be an expert out of political correctness or because you have political connections, you know, and this is the problem. And this is why it's easy for the various bodies to mandate this and to do that, but in fact, they don't know how to do that. And this leaves a vacancy for disaster.
Yeah, okay. Dr. Agri-Burke, we're down to the last 5 minutes or so now for the program.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thanks very much.
I'm here in London, UK, and thanks, Carl, that was very, very instructive because it falls into an area which psychiatry ignores here in England.
Yeah.
You have been trained. There is no ready evidence in the reports that have been done that training in restraints is going on and has been going on. But there are 3 factors to consider. One is that the admission rate of Caribbean patients in England is something like 3 to 4 times greater than all other patients if detention is used, sections of the Mental Health Act, 3 to 4 times more. And the question is, do they regard, is it likely that we are regarded as dangerous?
Say the whole thing, agree, big, black, and dangerous.
Indeed. And there was a study carried out, not a study, a report, an inquiry carried out on Orville Blackwood, Joseph Martin, and Joseph Watts, and Michael Martin, who were 3 patients who died in Broadmoor following restraint. All were black, all Caribbean. Yeah. And the question is, were the staff members in Broadmoor trained in restraint? And why was restraint being used? Well, I treated 2 of them, and one factor that has come to my attention is the reality that patients who have a formulation, diagnosis, want to call it that, of borderline personality disorder and are prone to explosive episodes in their lives are being called schizophrenia and are being seen as dangerous even before they come up with the big one. So you have a battle going on, and it has been going on for over 20 years. And there are over 60 papers done in Britain here showing that Caribbean patients, the only 1 million and a little bit of us here in Britain, are the dangerous people around. So there is this question as to the mindset of the people restraining, could be the police, could be
hospital staff,
could be mental health workers. And the question is really to you is, isn't it a good thing that Trinidad has not moved into a situation where it views its population as alien? Isn't it a good thing?
Who knows? We haven't gotten into their minds as yet. I was on a project. I was on a project with some Met Police in Guildford. And one of the police officers said to me, you know, we are afraid of mentally ill people. And that was like a mind-blowing experience because I thought police officers are trained to handle anything, you know, only to realize that they are human beings in uniform, you know. Of course. So I say this to say that there is huge fear among persons when they are confronted with persons with mental disorder. And that fear has to be dispelled through series of training and monitoring. The next thing is that when we do something wrong in psychiatry, we become overprotective because our job and our credibility is at stake. So the psychiatric setting needs to be a place with a different type of atmosphere, where it's okay to say, well, look, I'm wrong. I caused the patient to become disturbed. Knowing that I wouldn't lose my job, but possibly going to training or retraining to prevent the thing from happening again. But so, this ingrained fear that is driving us is quite a powerful tool, and it's stronger than what you've learned in the classroom.
Yeah. So just finally then, in terms of the future, have you got any plans to do, you know, develop a training module, or writing any more papers that will, you know, address some of the issues relating to training?
Yes, the first book was, it's a research-based study with, you know, figures and quantitative this and that and the other. What I'm doing is pursuing another book that is more instructive, right, and is common to the average reader, and will be more detailed, and you could use as a guide for curriculum development.
Excellent. So that's some way to the future based on the evidence and the lived experience. Most important.
Evidence-based driven.
Yeah. But the lived experience is so important as well as
very important.
Making the point.
Yes, I think if I could suggest that, you know, when you do this text on restraint, Jamaica, Barbados, you know, we have problems down there too. And so
Trinidad as well, yes.
And Alicia Spence, who runs ACCI, I know her well, and they're managing very well, actually.
Yeah, right.
Very well.
That's why I cited that earlier on.
Yeah,
they're doing great work. Right, okay then. So thank you very much, everybody. And Carl, thank you very much for taking us through your book and your insights. And I wish you all a very good evening and good day. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rudy.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all, guys.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl, for inviting us.
You're very welcome.
Okay. Bye.